right. We have one more talk today from my friend and colleague Timothy Jackson. Professor Jackson is an evolutionary toxinologist and co-leads the Australian Venom Research Unit at the University of Melbourne. Thanks so much for joining us, Tim. Early morning for you in Australia.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Thanks to Spiridon and Matt for the invitation. Big ask to follow that incredible talk by Jack. So thanks so much for that, Jack. I'm glad I got up for that, and I got up for Matt's talk as well, of course, which was great as expected. So I'm going to be talking about life being technical, but not necessarily mechanical. Um, yeah. Okay, so just really brief outline of the talk. We're going to talk about isms a little bit, as I was asked to in the initial invitation. Some technical difficulties, techniques, technique, Darwin and difference. Can't leave my boy Charlie Darwin out. Technicity and evolution. A little bit on machinic pharmacology with Félix Guattari, and then individuation, life according to Gilbert Simondon, who will appear also throughout the talk. Because I was asked to talk about isms, I think I need to do a little bit of preliminary housekeeping, a prefatory note on isms. They're generally so polysemous as to be obfuscatory, right? They're essentially of doxographical, so classificatory, and polemical or rhetorical utility, and hence, we are not exists. Often people don't want to be identified as a particular ist of some kind. And I mean, I'm even doing that here, right? I'm like, don't think I'm an ismist because I'm talking about isms. And vitalism, as we're going to talk a little bit about, is particularly one of these isms that no one really wants to be. And one might argue in this philosophical context that the role of speculative thought is actually to depose isms, insofar as isms pretend to be some kind of complete thought form. However, as Georges Canguilhem says, when it comes to theories, one must be certain of their origins and the direction of their development in order to interpret a return as a step backwards and an abandonment as a reaction or as treason, right? So we need to have some idea of the historical origins of various isms, their orders, the way they relate to each other. But, there's no need to avow or disavow. We don't need to say, we are vitalists or we're not vitalists or animists or materialists or whatever. Diagramming the relations amongst these different isms is what's interesting here, at least to me. So we're going to begin with Georges Canguilhem and his amazing paper, Aspects of Vitalism, and a whole series of quotes. It's going to be a lot of quotes in this talk, and I'm going to really rush through it, leave a lot of threads hanging. Hopefully there'll be time for some questions, but just, strap in, bear with me. So Canguilhem says, the term vitalism is appropriate for any biology careful to maintain its independence, okay? He says there's a permanent oscillation between mechanism and vitalism in the history of biological theory, right? This is nothing new, if we're having this problem today or we're seeing this problem in the 20th century, this is nothing new. One can consider this apparent theoretical oscillation the expression of an undiscovered dialectic. It is life, the object of study itself, that is the dialectical essence whose structure thought must espouse. The oppositions are thus transcended by life itself as it extends into a theory of life. Okay, so Simondon critiques hylomorphism, and Jack has just given us a really lovely talk about how hylomorphism and Aristotle as a conceptual persona is often vulgarized. All right, so Simondon critiques vulgar hylomorphism, we're going to say, right, concerning form and matter, that duality. Here, Simondon is saying that mechanism and vitalism are the extreme terms, like form and matter, which obscure the central dark zone, which is life itself, right? It is certain that, for vitalists, the fundamental biological phenomenon is the phenomenon of generation. Vitalists have confidence in the spontaneity of life. Vitalism therefore translates a permanent exigency of life in the living, the self-identity of life immanent to the living. This explains one of the characteristics that mechanist biologists and rationalist philosophers criticize in vitalism, which is its nebulousness and its vagueness. However, if vitalism is always an exigency, it's actually normal, says Canguilhem, that it would have trouble formulating itself in terms of determinations. The point here is that any theory that takes spontaneous variation as its first term must forego pretensions to complete explanation. We're going to see how that manifests in the Darwinian context in a little bit. Canguilhem goes on. A scientist who experiences a filial sentiment, a sentiment of sympathy towards nature, who finds life, soul, and meaning in them completely naturally, such a man is fundamentally a vitalist. Okay, so I've got Rousseau's painting here, just in sympathy with Matt and Spiridon's choice. So we could say this may be about an artist, not just a scientist, who is in sympathy with nature. The classical vitalist accepts the insertion of the living organism into a physical milieu to whose laws it constitutes an exception. Now, Canguilhem goes on, therein lies, in our opinion, the philosophically inexcusable fault. In the end, classical vitalism sins, paradoxically, only in its excessive modesty, in its reluctance to universalize its conception of experience. Once one recognizes the originality of life, one must comprehend matter within life and the science of matter, which is science itself, within the activity of the living. So he's kind of sketching two different types of vitalism here. The life is exceptional form of vitalism, a kind of minimal vitalism, which he's a little bit critical of, and a different form of vitalism in which life is encompassing or fundamental, which he's a little bit more positive about. You know, Canguilhem is one of those few people who maybe would affirm that he was a vitalist or a rational vitalist. But we do have to ask this question. So if life is encompassing or even exceptional, what exactly is life? This is a pretty vexed question. I'm not going to solve it in this talk. But we turn now to Deleuze and Guattari on vitalism. And they actually embrace a certain vitalism, you know, and of course they're iconoclasts, so they enjoy thumbing their nose at those people who would say, hey, we're not vitalists. So in A Thousand Plateaus, they say things like, not all life is confined to the organic strata. Rather, the organism is that which life sets against itself in order to limit itself, right? This identity between organism and life here. And there is life, there is a life all the more intense, all the more powerful for being anorganic. So life then here is drive or force or power. It's something that organization, the organism, limits, canalizes, or directs. In metallurgy, they say, variability of matters tends to be replaced by the matter of a continuous variation. What metal and metallurgy bring to light is a life proper to matter, a vital state of matter as such, a material vitalism, eliding the antagonism between materialism and vitalism here, that doubtless exists everywhere, but is ordinarily hidden or covered, rendered unrecognizable, dissociated by the, brackets, vulgar, hylomorphic model. They're channeling Simondon here to some degree. So life then is the process of continuous variation, spontaneity again, and that which is hidden and dissociated by the vulgar hylomorphic model, which separates and substantializes form and matter. So enter Simondon more directly. And the physical versus the vital. So Simondon says there is a domain of knowledge of the physical and a domain of knowledge of the living, but there is not, in the same sense, a real domain of the physical and a real domain of the living separated by an equally real boundary. The physical and the vital are distinct according to structures and functions, or maybe operations, without being separate according to the substantial real. Simondon is an anti-substantialist. The opposition of the inert and the living would be the product of the application of the dualizing schema, here again, the dualizing schema of hylomorphic origin with its characteristic zone of central obscurity. However, the operational distinction nonetheless exists. Physical individuation, I'm going to talk more about individuation in Simondon's terms, is considered here as an individuation that jumps the gun, i.e. that does not sufficiently remain in suspense at its origin. Vital individuation would be like a dilation of the inchoate stage that makes possible an organization, a deepening of this extreme beginning. So life and non-living matter, in a certain sense, can be treated as two speeds of the evolution of the real. He goes on. Biological individuation does not fully resolve tensions. It leaves the problematic latent, subsistent. Life is a first individuation. It has not resolved everything. We have movement to go ever further. We have tension and potentials for becoming other, for heterogenesis in Deleuze-Guattarian terms, for recommencing an individuation that is not destructive of the first. This force, though, is not vital now. Okay, this is distinct from Deleuze and Guattari here. It is pre-vital. So what's generic is pre-vital, or fundamental is pre-vital here. So microphysical reality then is pre-physical and pre-vital, since it is pre-individual, key concept for Simondon. Above this scale, there is physical individuation when the system is capable of receiving information a single time, then develops and amplifies this initial singularity by individuating in a non-self-limited way. If the system is capable of successively receiving several inputs of information, i.e. of compatibilizing several singularities, then individuation is vital, self-limited and organized. This is the key distinction for him. But for Etienne Rabot, a French biologist that Simondon quotes a lot, relies on quite a bit, the intrinsic property of living matter resides in, quote, this incessant process of destruction and reconstruction in accordance with exchanges with the exterior, which constitutes its metabolism. Some notes of Hans Jonas there, perhaps. All right, now we're going to turn to techne. This is going to be a somewhat breathless talk, like I said. So following on from my friend Jason Tuckwell, in his 2020 paper, Technics and Agency, a few quotes from that. Techne governs the series of actions and powers to manipulate efficient causation. Function clarifies the sense in which technique concerns particular manipulations of techne in order to act, to work, to produce, and so on. The functions of the living already exhibit a sort of telos, an emergent capacity for purposive action. It is possible to suppose that agents are coextensive with a sort of artificiality, something synthetic and not given by their primary generative conditions. Okay, so in this sense, agency or artificiality is the overcoming of first nature. It's a deviation of the efficient causes a tergo, causes from behind, that characterize physical situatedness. Agency is technique deployed in service of some end, functional purpose. But in a generalized ontogenetic conception, such as we'd find in Simondon and many of the process relational philosophers that I think a lot of us here know and love, this also involves a self-overcoming as much as the overcoming of a nature perceived as an absolute exteriority. If we're stuck in a rut, a repetitive compulsion, we have a toxic habit, our agency is compromised, even if the rut was constructed by our agency in the first place, right? We're not just subjected here to an exteriority that pushes us, that we might resist. So techne and praxis are related in this sense that we cultivate practices that help us to escape pathological basins of attraction, to dissolve toxic habits, etc. And escaping a basin of attraction is actually akin to overcoming a formal cause, so not just an efficient cause pushing us from behind. Note that a principle of stationary action does not do this, but describes a contextually determined behavior. Techne as mediation, which is one of its key resonances in Aristotle, is akin to niche construction, so controlling some of the degrees of freedom of the environment, which is a connection I'm not going to go into in detail here, but is a fertile one. Back to Canguilhem, now on machine and organism. Mechanism comes from mechane, whose meaning engine contains two senses, that of ruse and stratagem on the one hand, and that of machine on the other. Essentially, a machine is a mediation, or as the mechanists say, a relay. Key point, Spiridon made this earlier, a mechanism does not create anything. Okay, it's also from aspects of vitalism. A stratagem is a machination, and compare this with Deleuze, Guattari, and machinism. There, machinic elements cut flows, distribute forces, but are not primary processes, are not generative in themselves. Back to Canguilhem, the conceptual production of the living machine requires an obligation to imitate a prior organic given. Okay, this is the conceptual production of the living machine. This is a reference to Descartes. The construction of a mechanical model presupposes a vital original. The model for the living machine is the living itself. Okay, read that essay. Everybody read Machine and Organism and Aspects of Vitalism. So lucid. There's so much in there. I could have done a whole talk on just those two essays. The theory of animal machines in Descartes is inseparable from the cogito ergo sum. The radical distinction between soul and body, thought and extension, entails affirming the substantial unity of all matter, regardless of its form, and of all thought, regardless of its function. Compare this with the operational distinction that we've already heard, particularly in Simondon, which might enable us to say something like sometimes matter minds, sometimes mind matters, cribbing a little bit from Charles Sanders Peirce, who's always in the background of my thought. Matter is effet mind, Peirce would say. It can easily be said that there is more purpose in the machine, says Canguilhem, than in the organism. a vicariousness of functions, a polyvalence of organisms, or polycomputation, Michael Evan might say, exists in the organism. So purpose is unified, homogenized in the machine, right? But primary variation, indeed self-difference, exists in an organism, which is what, again, enables heterogenesis, becoming other. In Simondon, the biological individual is described as more than a unity. It is in tension with itself, right? Unlike a really efficiently functioning machine. Again, turning to Darwin and the Darwinian difference, or what Jérôme Rossin-Volant calls the Darwin-Hooker principle. So Darwin's primary intervention, really against the thesis of special creation, and again, vulgar hylomorphism, with apologies to Aristotle, is to make variation or difference the first principle. Matt mentioned this earlier. Species thus exist as clumpings in the distribution of variation. Selection accounts for the existence of these loci of relative stability. So as Rossin-Volant puts it in his excellent 2012 paper, Pure Variation and Organic Stratification, there is a pure variability of the living, an inherent tendency to vary, it is Darwin quote, which remains without determined or perhaps determinable cause. This is intrinsic in the sense that natural selection only intervenes in it secondarily and thus extrinsically, even if natural selection also tends to conserve and amplify this intrinsic variability of the living. Okay, gestures towards the evolution of evolvability there. Compare this, in a prelude to talking about animism in just a moment, to Amazonian multinaturalism according to Eduardo Viveros de Castro. Quote, we could say that Amazonian multinaturalism affirms not so much a variety of natures as the naturalness of variation, variation as nature. Okay, very, very resonant with the other perspectives we're talking about here. All right, turning to Plato really briefly, there's a sense in which this kind of view might be thought of as anti-Platonic. It's maybe anti-Platonist, but there's still a lot of resonance with aspects of Plato's thought, right? So Plato's receptacle, reclaiming mum, I'm saying, in choric materialism or martyrism. Plato's receptacle, the chora, is described as a mass of plastic material. It's the precursor, I think, of Aristotelian matter. Plato says anything that is to receive in itself every kind of character must be devoid of character. It's also by nature a matrix for everything. Matrix, obviously, womb, right? However, there is this cryptic doctrine in the Timaeus of choric necessity. Timaeus says there is in us a large element of the contingent and random. This world came into being from a mixture and combination of necessity and intelligence. It was by submission of necessity to reasonable persuasion, i.e., by the submission of the chora, by the demiurge working in light of the forms, that this universe here was originally constituted. To give a true account of how the universe came to be, one must mix in the kind of the wandering cause, Kleinemann, and how it is its nature to cause motion. In the primitive chaos, compare this with Hesiod's account of cosmogenesis, of the chora, there was no homogeneity or balance in the forces that filled it. No part of it was in equilibrium, but it swayed unevenly in all the directions as it was shaken by the forces, and in being moved, it in turn shook them. And the things that were moved were constantly being separated and carried in different directions, rather like the contents of a winnowing basket. I mean, I love this so much. This is like the origin of the metaphor of coarse graining, which we use so much still in system science. But this process of endogenous and constructive coarse graining, this is the core of coarse graining itself, right? This is not intelligence projecting form onto matter, right? It leads to the formation of the incipient elements, but then sure enough, the demiurge comes in to finish off the job, to shape them completely according to forms and numbers. So it's only incipient formation or self-organization here. All right, animism. How does animism sit with all of this? In Animism Revisited, the anthropologist Nurit David defines animism as a relational onto-epistemology and draws on Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the dividual, as opposed to the individual, as a person constitutive of relations. So we, whatever we are shaped or produced by the meaningful, and meaningful because constitutive, relationships we have with other beings. We're informed by alterities. We interdependently and reciprocally. Animism need not imply, contrary to the way the term is often used, a pervasiveness of mind or even minds. It's characterized by immanentism, another ism that comes from Marshall Sahlins. The plane of immanence, Deleuze-Guattarian concept, is not mind. is not a perceptual system in itself, and neither can it be, since there's nothing external to it which it could perceive. Relationships of minds occur within the plane, but you cannot sum them to recover a unified mind. One's imminent encounters in very specific contexts and circumstances are what makes one what one is. This is actually a selectionist view, right? So it's ecological, quite obviously, but it's also evolutionary. Both synchronic and diachronic relationships are informing here. The way the impact of encounters is inherited over various timescales so that epochal events occur across all of these different timescales is key here. As immanentists, though, there are no transcendent forms as such, just immanent informants. The freestanding core, as I'm calling it, or the dark precursor, as Schelling might say, is animist maybe, or is it vitalist animism? So purely rhetorically, I sometimes refer to process relational philosophy as vitalist animism. The demiurge and forms can emerge as structures which are operative in the sense that they canalize and constrain further operations. They emerge as achievements of operations, and then they canalize, they're inherited, they canalize further operations, right? But they are not eternal. They're not preformed. This is anti-preformationism here. All right, back to Darwin and the Darwin-Peirce-Lewontin triad. This is variation, selection, and inheritance, and it describes that process that I've just mentioned pretty nicely. So variation is constitutive or intrinsic to all levels of biological systems. It's not just mutation, right? It's also stochastic gene expression, Brownian motion in between cells, spontaneous activity in nervous systems, stochastic behavior, like me waving my arms, all of this stuff, right? Selection occurs across levels, both internally and externally, abstracting and amplifying subsets of standing variation, right? And forms or species thus are relatively stable clumps in the field of primary variation, as I've already said. Unlike in vulgar hylomorphism, where variations are accidental deviations from species essences, variability here or generativity is primary, right? Matter thus is not passive, but form and matter are these extreme terms which obscure the central zone of life itself, as we've been discussing. All right, so compare neo-Darwinism then with what might be described as a speculative evolutionary philosophy. Neo-Darwinism is actually a hylomorphic regression in which the genome imbues the matter or phenotype with form. This is an argument made very forcefully by the French philosopher of biology, Jean-Jacques Cupiec. All evolutionary innovation in neo-Darwinism, as we know, occurs via stochastic gene mutation. This isn't Darwinian, right? This is a misnomer. It's really Weissmanian. Darwin does not have a single specific mechanism of inheritance. He assumes variation arising at various levels is potentially heritable. So now Isabel Stengers, in her 2009 paper Toward a Speculative Approach to Biological Evolution, has this to say: the dangerous character of Darwin's idea, and she's subtweeting Daniel Dennett there, does not concern primarily the non-biologists who would be forced by biology to renounce their illusions. It is, in fact, the reasoning of the biologists themselves that is called into question by the consequence of biological liberty. For this liberty connects with a conception of evolution that, first of all, endangers the power of biological explanations, endangers the power of complete explanations, right? Reductive explanations, right? We saw this in Canguilhem. Such is therefore the meaning of a speculative approach to the biology of evolution. The speculative appetite is nothing other than the appetite for the ways in which living beings have invented always singular and risky responses to general questions. This is very consistent with the Darwinian approach, which does not explain particularity, right? Particularity is the given, but it makes explanation of patterns within the distribution of particulars possible, right? There's a very important distinction in my view. Back to Simondon, and now the genesis of technicity. The technicity that manifests itself, Simondon says, in the use of objects provisionally resolves the problems posed by the primitive and original phase of man's relationship to the world. However, coming into being does not stop at the discovery of technicity. From being a solution, technicity once more becomes a problem, right? So there's this same kind of iterative individuation going on here. Technicity must never be considered an isolated reality, but as part of a system. Being the result of an evolution, technicity is also the depository of a capacity to evolve, okay? Evolution of evolvability through technicity here, right? Technicity is heir to a capacity for evolutionary divergence, which is generic, we're saying here. Techne is, in the terms of Jason Tuckwell again, a re-problematizing of the primary problematic field. That's the pre-individual for Simondon. It's a deviation, in Jason's terms, acting on primary deviance, right? The primary nature of things is deviant. Techne correlates deviations, as we'll see. Technical objects versus living systems. Important distinction, right? The technical object distinguishes itself from the natural being in the sense that it is not part of the world. It intervenes as mediator between man and the world. It is, in this respect, the first detached object. The object is intermediary between the world and the subject, and its initial form is that of the technical object, okay? Simondon often makes these very, very bold claims and then nuances them. But according to this conception I'm presenting, organisms are technical, but they are not technical objects. Traits are also not technical objects. However, in the phenomenon of interlineage exaptation, for example, toxin sequestration, which I'm about to talk about, the exapted or appropriated traits are in fact extracted or detached, right? These are arguably maybe the first technical objects. So we turn now to machinic pharmacoecology with Félix Guattari. I won't read that quote. Okay, chemical ecology. This is essentially my field. Ecologies are shaped, coordinated, and managed at all levels using molecular means. Obviously, not exclusively. From pheromones to toxins, organisms use exochemicals to influence and manipulate one another's behavior and morphology. This includes everything from bacteria inducing choanoflagellates to form multicellular colonies with so-called effector molecules, and similarly, myriad marine invertebrates undergo metamorphosis when they encounter certain bacterial metabolites. Okay, this is a very, very pervasive phenomenon of symbiosis. And chemical ecology encompasses everything from that end of the spectrum to the usage of molecular tools, i.e. drugs, by humans. All right, tool use is literally economics, the management of the home. Now, Guattari says that common usage suggests that we speak of the machine as a subset of technology. We should, however, consider the problematic of technology as dependent on machines and not the inverse. The machine would become the prerequisite for technology rather than its expression. Okay, there's some problematic tensions here between Simondon and Guattari and a number of the theses here. I'm not going to develop them. I'm going to leave threads hanging. This is going to be problematic. But we're going to consider whether toxins might be considered technical objects when they are exapted or appropriated, not when they are traits encoded by the organisms of by the genomes of the organisms using them. But okay, so that nature is machinic in Guattarian terms is a prerequisite for human techne, right? So the development of technical objects is often reliant on accumulated natural work, right? Toxin, like drug and pharmacon, is a very ambiguous term, and one of the many reasons for this is because of the context dependency of toxicity and indeed all bioactivities, actually all properties, but I'm not going to go into that. Toxin resistance and toxin sequestration are phenomena that exist in nature, and toxin sequestration is when one organism appropriates another organism's bioactive molecules for its own use. So the wanderer butterfly gets its toxins from the milkweed. The tiger keelback, that snake there, gets its toxins from the toads that it eats. The strawberry poison dart frog from ants. The nudibranch steals whole stinging cells, cnidocytes, from the hydrozoans, the hydroids that it feeds on. This is called kleptonidae, right? Humans do something similar to what these organisms do. We just call it pharmacology. Okay, toxins as tools, yeah. Tool use is quite common in nature, right? Contrary to older beliefs, perhaps. Tool use is a form of exaptation. It's using something that evolved for one purpose, or indeed no purpose at all, for a different purpose. Toxin sequestration is thus tool use, according to this definition that I'm giving you a very schematic version of. Pharmacology is tool use, right? Back to Deleuze and Guattari. A technical element remains abstract, entirely undetermined, as long as one does not relate it to an assemblage it presupposes. There are no functions, activities, even properties outside of context. It is the social or collective machine, the machinic assemblage, that determines what is a technical element at a given moment. What is its usage, extension, comprehension? Guattari would say its powers of enunciation, right? What it does, right? Its functions, etc. All right. Ecology of molecules. The function of a protein is fundamentally relational. A protein must interact with another protein in order to affect its functional role. Proteins on their own do nothing. True both for endo and exophysiological. Endo is obviously within the body of the organism that produces it, exo in the body of another organism. Both are physiologically active, of course. Compare this with animism. Exophysiological proteins find their targets in the body, as I said, of other organisms. Toxins are exophysiological proteins, but they're not the only ones. So are pheromones. There are lots of kinds. Now, a change of context may enable a change in function. When a protein enters a new environment, it encounters novel interaction partners, novel propensities for interaction. This can be the origins of the capacity to develop a novel function. This can be facilitated by stochastic gene expression. These are forms of primary variation that I'm talking about here. Injection into a target organism, which can be incidental, also, of course, introduces a protein, for example, to a potential novel range of interaction partners. And then what we get is coevolution of proteins and delivery mechanisms. This is this selection occurring across levels, bottom up and top down, we might say. When a gene structure changes, this can also occur, and this can result in novel affordances for a protein encoded by that gene, and in fact, a change in ecology, a change in interaction partners, even without a change of location. This can be facilitated by point mutations. There are molecular and organismal analogies here, which are very rich, but I'm not going to develop. When constraints are reduced in general, rapid change can occur, right, in biological evolution. This can be called escape from adaptive conflict, which is a form of molecular subfunctionalization, so that's in a molecular context. It's also known as escape and radiate coevolution in the organismal ecology context. Back to Deleuze and Guattari. The distinction we would like to propose between a machine and an assemblage. A machine is like a set of cutting edges that insert themselves into the assemblage, undergoing deterritorialization and draw variations and mutations out of it. For there are no mechanical effects. Effects are always machinic. Key distinction for them between the machinic and the mechanical. In other words, these effects depend on a machine that is plugged into an assemblage and has been freed through deterritorialization, right? The machinic is relational, unlike the mechanical for Deleuze and Guattari. So in chemical ecology contexts, we sometimes will speak of disruptive pharmacology, the toxin, or perhaps now teacher, as a machinic particle. Toxins mediate antagonistic encounters by entering the physioeconomy of target organisms and reorganizing it. Organisms are not organizationally closed, bracket critique of autopoiesis in the organizational account. They disrupt set points and occasionally install new ones. Symbiotic slippage can occur from antagonism, in the case of a toxin, to mutualism in various forms of symbiosis. This can lead to the constitution of novel assemblages, including novel organisms, via processes like endosymbiosis. This is a translation from disruptive pharmacology to what I call normative pharmacology. Novel physioeconomies maintained by formally disruptive chemistry, all right? This can also be tracked as the transition from exo, from an alterity, to endo, from ecology to physiology. And we can also have a lot of rich resonances with drugs and society, the way drugs relate to different cultures. I have a whole lecture series on this that I deliver at University of Melbourne. Okay, back to Simondon, and how does he situate himself then in relation to major themes in biological theory, like adaptationism? Simondon says the notion of adaptation would lead us to see the coming into being of the relation between man and the world as tending toward a state of stable equilibrium. But this does not appear to be correct in man's case, perhaps no more than it is for any living being. If one wanted to preserve a vitalist foundation for this hypothesis of genetic coming into being, one could call upon the notion of the élan vital. This notion is excellent for demonstrating what is lacking in the notion of adaptation, but it is not compatible with it, and an antagonism without possible mediation subsists between adaptation and the élan vital. Okay. So he says then that it seems that these two opposed notions, as the couple they form, can be replaced by the notion of the individuation of oversaturated systems conceived as successive resolutions of tensions through the discovery of structures at the heart of a system rich in potential. He goes on to say that potential is one of the forms of the real. Potential is not opposed to the real. Where have we seen this before? Okay, throughout this talk, we've seen this idea. And no, it's not Hegelian. It's more like Novalis than Hegel, actually. But here, adaptation and the élan vital, supposedly antagonistic, are extreme terms, and what's in the middle, now he's saying, is this notion of individuation, but again, is life itself. Evolution is not an optimization process, right? So we should all know this. It is not reducible to the calculus of variations or a principle of stationary action. Moreover, Darwin is no adaptationist, and Simondon kind of misses this, where he talks about Darwin, he mischaracterizes him in a number of ways. Given the firstness of variation, you can't be an adaptationist if there are always properties of organisms that are in excess of adaptation, grist for the mill of novel adaptations, right? You can compare here the zero-force evolutionary law of Brandon and McShay, which is thoroughly Darwinian, with the élan vital. Okay, back to physical and vital individuation, this key distinction. We've said physical systems individuate all at once, they jump the gun. This is becoming physical, since the pre-individual is pre-physical and pre-vital. Living systems, on the other hand, defer complete individuation indefinitely. They are neotenic in this sense. They maintain the charge of the pre-individual and do not exhaust it. They're like pedomorphic physical individuals. It's a wonderful concept. The organism or subject comprises the coupling of individuated and pre-individual realities. It thus maintains an internal problematic. It's more than a unity. It's at odds with itself. It is frustrated, which means it has sequestered degrees of freedom. This is the pathway to agency via the ramification of self-selection or self-organization, requiring a complex structure which can contain spaces for spontaneous variation, chora, which is also likened to a space, to subsist internally. These again, stochastic gene expression, spontaneous brain activity, stochastic behavior, and the rest. And just note, polemically, I will say a dissipative structure is not self-organizing. Agency, zeroing right in on this, individuation as elicitation. So baby king cobra there, I elicited a defensive behavior from it, the poor thing, for the sake of a photo. Agency is the differential canalization of spontaneous variation in service of an end. I've said this. Spontaneous variation is not in itself agency. Mustn't conflate these. It goes every which way, not any way in particular, right? A principle of stationary action, again, is not agency, but pure contextual determinism. Also really important to make this distinction. Individuation occurs relationally. It never occurs in isolation, as both Simondon and Jung would affirm. When an alterity selects, it or refers to or elicits a subset of the organism subject's constitutive variation. This is what you need to be right now. Amplify that subset. Come forth, reorganize. This is elicitation as opposed to solicitation. Selection by alterity is secondary in this context to self-selection. This is the genesis of information, of signification. Information is a key concept for Simondon, which I'm not going to go into right now, but it's the genesis of information, of signification, or indeed of the Peircean interpretant. In Peircean terms, the subset of variation in the organism subject is the object, the alterity is the sign, and individuation is the genesis of the novel individual. The process of interpretation, that's the genesis of signification. The sign is not intrinsically significative, and that is, again, the process of individuation. So life is individuation, life is technical. Last slide, I think. When we consider, Simondon says, individuation to be life itself, then it can be seen as a discovery in a situation of conflict of a new axiomatic, incorporating and unifying all the various elements of this situation in a system that embraces the individual. To live consists in being agent, milieu, and element of individuation. Perceptive, active, and adaptive behaviors are aspects of the fundamental and perpetuated operation of individuation that constitutes life. An interlinking of successive resolutions insofar as each previous resolution can be taken back up and reincorporated in subsequent resolutions. Again, that's the vital versus the physical. Techne, then, is deviation acting on primary deviance, as we've said. It's differential canalization of degrees of freedom. It's actually the correlation of deviations as opposed to equilibrium, which is uncorrelated stochasticity. At least the equilibrium at the end of time, heat death of the universe, is that kind of thing. A Simondonian conception of information, riffing on Bateson, anachronistically, of course, because Simondon is working earlier, would be a difference that makes a difference given a difference. So primary difference, tension, or disparation is necessary for there to be information, necessary for there to be technique. These are my acknowledgements. And I'll give the last word to Canguilhem. In the end, to do justice to vitalism is simply to give life back to it. And if there's time, I'll invite questions. Oh, and I'll see your Rousseau with a Max Ernst painting. I had L'Ange du Foyer, Max Ernst, at the beginning of the presentation, and this is The Joy of Life. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tim. Does everyone want to just hang out till like 5? I mean, we can just continue talking until we have no more energy left. I think we were about 8 or 9 minutes behind, but I want to make sure we have at least 10 minutes to chat with Tim here. So,
or with anybody else for that matter.
yeah. Well, we have time for general conversation tomorrow too, but Tim and I get to chat all the time. We've done so many over the last couple of years. He knows what I would want to pick on him about, but I'll hold off. I'll let Farzad ask something. Go ahead. You're yeah, unmute.
Yeah, really appreciated that. Was thinking about the Plato part. It sounds like from your perspective, then creation is a technical activity for Plato. Canalizing the
Yes. Yeah.
creative activity and actually handing it off to the planets. So it's not like the demiurge comes swooping in at the end to finish the hora off.
Mhm.
It goes to the planets to do their bit, and then after that, it goes to us to do our bit. So it's all technical from the start, it sounds like. I hadn't thought of it like that before.
Yeah, I think that that's a fair characterization. I don't think so spontaneous variation is not intrinsically technical, but it's what's required for the technical to emerge is the point here, Ryan. But somehow, and of course Plato says it's a dark or difficult and obscure idea, somehow that technical activity is emerging, at least in an incipient sense, in Plato prior to the demiurge is quite obviously like an artisan or a technician, right? But it's somehow emerging imminently prior to that. And so the emphasis that I'm putting, or a number of the thinkers that I'm putting, that I referenced, um, are making here is on this at least incipient degree of kind of self-organization before there is a kind of existence of self and other, such that you can have this selection by alterities or external imposition of something like a formal cause, or the activity of technicians. So yeah.
It's interesting. He calls it bastard reasoning too, the only way you can get it, which is a really twisted metaphor, but it's
Mm.
fatherless on the one hand. On the other hand, it's not quite right. And
Mm.
having that in as a important part of inferential thinking kind of
Mm.
reminds me of abduction. It kind
Yeah.
of adds another twist to the whole picture, which is really wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, very, very strong resonances with abduction, absolutely. And I think what we're talking about here is it's bastard reasoning because we're thinking at the limit of thought, right?
Yeah.
So when we're thinking, we're already doing this
Without
form.
access to origins. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we're already doing, we can't really think, pure variation or something in itself, right? We're always doing this selective thing in the act of thinking. So in saying that there's something kind of just beyond that, um, from which that has to emerge, I mean, you could say, and I think a lot of the process relational philosophers, whether it's Whitehead or Peirce or Schelling or whatever, do give some deference to the irrational that is required, for the emergence of the rational. And I'm saying, I think that's what Darwin is also saying, right? That this primary variation there, and this is why, as Stengers very aptly puts it, if we really take that insight seriously, we can't have complete explanations. And we certainly can't use, like, we can't say natural selection or something like is an explanation in itself of any given particular. If I could say that, I work as an evolutionary biologist. If I could just say that, I wouldn't have anything to do, right? It's like, why does this snake have the kind of venom that it has? Oh, natural selection. No, I have to plug in a huge amount of empirical data, do all this attempt to reconstruct an evolutionary history with the latest methods in comparative genomics, all of this stuff. And then at the end, there's still like the indivisible remainder or whatever, right? The explanation is never complete, no matter how much data I bring to bear on it. But it gives us the possibility of a limited kind of explanation to take variation first. So my point would be that if we put some form prior to variation, that would be putting an unexplained explainer at the beginning, right? That would be something that you can never get behind, something you can never explain. And I'm saying I don't want to do that. I'm gonna like admit of a limit to explanation by not trying to so complete explanation by actually making a posit, like a heavy postulate that is itself unexplainable. If that makes sense.
Maybe this will be a nice segue to Jack, just because you were problematizing the usual reading of hylomorphism. But Farzad, you were mentioning the planets, and I guess you were mentioning the planets because they're the wanderers, and that's like the variation, the difference amidst the sameness of the fixed constellations. And but in Plato, while he's acknowledging the wanderers and wandering and the role of the Cora. Um, famously, the problem of the planets that Plato poses is that, well, that wandering, erratic motion must somehow be explainable in a rational way. There must be uh, a sense in which, there's another way of looking at this that would reveal the hidden order. That retrograde motion, that strange loops in the sky can't possibly be there. There must be perfect circles somewhere, seems to be Plato's intuition. And so I wonder if in terms of what Jack you were doing with the form matter distinction, relativizing that like, copper and tin, they're mixing together and it just sort of it's yeah, complicating any hierarchical relationship between form and matter, and what's matter in one case could be form in the next case, and so on. And that maybe we can read Plato as pointing us to that type of relationship between the same and the different, between form and material. I don't know. You're probably going somewhere totally different, Jack, but I just wanted to
I hope that's where he's going. I hope
No,
that's where
that's
he's going.
obviously exactly where I'm going. Well, I was gonna bring back up this book, the Numa book, and highly recommend that. And he basically poses it as Aristotle kind of combating Plato's demiurgic view of a craftsman, and instead saying we're made in God's image or whatever because we're an embryonic power of instrumentally creating, all the multiplicity of the world. So the embryo to full development process is what God is. God is just kind of like frozen in the pure embryonic potentiality to create reality, right?
Which is Ruyer, right?
Exactly. Well, and like coming from like my talk and then hearing yours, I'm like, wow, this idea of instrumentality could be called technicity, and really is like that ambiguous. And the term organon means both an instrument and a organ.
Yeah.
And this idea of like middle voice, right? So you have the object that's transitively interacted with, but then you have a self-instrumentalizing power, right? This kind of immanent. So I mean, it's just furthering the discussion. It's not a question, but
well, I love it, and I love the way you're reading Aristotle, and I'm definitely going to need to take a look at those books, and we're going to need to talk more.
definitely.
But makes Aristotle already Simondonian,
Yeah.
And I think Simondon kind of recognizes that, to be honest. Like I think we people working with Simondon, and you're generalizing, and he's critiquing the hylomorphism and all of that. And I just loved your point, and I should have had that vulgar thing in my presentation.
Have you read the imagination lectures by Simondon? Because in that he has this line about the Mona Lisa being an entelechy because it's like the beginning and the end of a smile or something like that. And I don't know. And then the Ruyer, like obviously he talks about work activity, which is just purely Aristotelian.
Yeah. No, I really love it, and I think the work you're doing is so vital for kind of re-problematizing that reception history of Aristotle. And I obviously don't know those texts anything like as well as you do, but it's there in Simondon in the sense that Aristotle is kind of always the most important thinker for Simondon. I mean, even though he is critiquing Aristotle, right? He is saying that Aristotle is the thinker of this middle ground. But that when you make a diagrammatic schematism of that thought and of the hylomorphic thought, you end up with the extreme terms as your operators, and then the middle ground just goes missing. And I love that as a problematization of Plato, because I think Matt and I have talked a lot about the kind of immanent problematic of Plato. So in the Timaeus, there's a self-problematizing really of Plato, and obviously elsewhere as well, and in the Parmenides, following on from the Timaeus and everything. But I really love the way you are dynamizing the reading of, or maybe just restoring its inherent dynamism, but of Plato there, and of Aristotle, sorry. And then yes, Ruyer and Simondon really emerging as these Aristotelians. And also then on the hylomorphic point, which Matt was also making, Simondon is so thoroughgoing in his anti-substantialism. And so his notion of allegmatics, right, the operational analogies. And so, the vital and the physical, as I was talking about, are not substantially distinct, but they are operationally distinct, right? And this is really important for Simondon, and why he would say that he is not a vitalist, right? But form and matter then are not substantially distinct. They're operationally distinct. So just like Matt was saying, I think, what's form in one case can be matter in another. This is the same with the actual and the virtual, right? These are operationally distinct, not substantially distinct. This is really important for thinking the pre-individual in Simondon, and where I'm gesturing towards things like stochastic gene expression, spontaneous brain activity, and all of that. Those are all actually examples of the pre-individual, but they're of course also actual and even individuated in some sense, right? Stochastic gene expression, you're talking about actual distinct gene products, but it's at the level of their distributions. This is why cybernetics is so crucial, and that whole lineage of thought from statistical mechanics, actually from like Boltzmann coming out of Darwin. I was going to talk about that, but there was no space for it. But Boltzmann coming out of Darwin, blah 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 blah, cybernetics, complexity science, coarse graining, all of this kind of stuff, at the level of the distributions, the potential for differential canalization of the molecules, that's where they're pre-individual. They're individual and actual at one level, but they're virtual in terms of their distributions at another level. Yeah,
exactly. I will say just really quick about the Plato, because I do think it's already in Plato. Like, I think that the self-problematization of the technical model in the Timaeus and beyond is already in question. And so when this author both says like Aristotle's overthrowing this idea in Plato, and he's doing like, I think it's just unpacking fully that problematization. So anyway,
yeah, I think we just need to differentiate ourselves from these mighty ancestors as well, because otherwise, like, what are we going to do? It's all in Plato.
Definitely.
It's all in Spinoza. I'm hearing this all the time at the moment. Spinoza's solved it all.
Well, that might be true.
Yeah, Jack agrees with that, probably.
And it's Spinoza. What I want to know, and we'll talk about another time, is whether Spinoza has this notion of like primary variation or primary difference, because it's like this is a question, has been a question for me for a long time about Darwin, because, Darwin is very much a man of his time, and obviously evolution, and, this is all he doesn't even use that term, as I always say in the first edition of On the Origin of Species, because he doesn't want to be assimilated to the very contemporary thought about evolution and its relationship to capital P progress and all of that. He's very much a man of his time, but it does seem like this, variation first principle is something that is perhaps original to his thought. I mean, it's certainly, he originally derives it in the sense that, I mean, again, and we're just saying, well, the Cora, so clearly it's not, original to Darwin in some sense. But there's a certain kind of insistence on it, at least an epistemological insistence. Darwin is not a metaphysician, right? And then there's an aspect of Peirce, which was, again, is another whole section of this paper that'll eventually be written out of this talk. But and Peirce is himself at odds with himself, as Matt also gestured towards, like, do we have a cosmos of firstness first, or do we also have incipient thirds, blah, blah, blah. But there are a lot of places in which Peirce talks about, variation as primary, and the most I guess the most obvious character of reality is its variation, its variability, and we somehow need to account for that. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you so much. I have to run. I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Love your talk, Jack.
Thank you.
Good.
We're already after hours. Hey,
Cheers,
Josh, I
guys.
see your hand. See you later, Jack. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, thanks. I put my hand down because I wasn't sure it would go here, but I felt like where you guys ended up, I think this is really interesting. For me, in Peirce, I think there's a nice overlap between Peirce and Simondon, in the sense that I do think, going back to like the scholastics, for example, how you have not only potentiality and actuality, but habituality, and that I think for me, I totally agree with you that what I really love about Peirce and Simondon is they do frame nicely. So in the case of Simondon, the individual intention always with the pre-individual. And then similarly, I think you have this tension with Peirce, with firstness and secondness, but that there has to be something else that resolves this tension, that maintains the very careful and brittle maintenance of this tension. And I think for Simondon, it's the internal resonance. And I think for Peirce, it's his agapistic evolution, his positive sympathy. I think these things parallel nicely. Would you be willing to comment on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there would be a lot to say. I mean, so internal resonance then in the model that I really briefly presented, where I did map kind of individuation as elicitation onto Peirce, like right at the end there. Internal resonance would be, something that is shared between, sign and object, that enables the emergence of signification, or enables the emergence of the interpretant. And I think probably Simondon and Peirce would also agree. I think there are tons of resonances between Simondon. I mean, there are triads like everywhere in Simondon as well. So, I mean, of course, not only in Peirce. And some people think Simondon is very Hegelian. I don't, and he certainly didn't. But I think there are a lot more resonances with Peirce, and sometimes it's almost amazing that Simondon never references Peirce or never references Whitehead. Like, I don't know if he never read them or what, or he's concealing his debt to them or something. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of resonance, internal resonance. So there's this allegmatic thing. There's this analogical relationship between what's external and what's internal that enables them to enter into a resonance, and thus to create something that is not their synthesis, but that is something that is genuinely novel, which is the interpretant. And I agree that has a lot of resonance with agapistic evolution in Peirce, absolutely. So of course it's not a pure tachism, right? There is a taichic aspect, which is this primary variation. It's certainly not anarchistic. It's not law-like. That would be solicitation as opposed to elicitation. So I think this elicitation is like things reaching towards each other, and in their coming together, creating something absolutely novel, which I do think is a really nice description of Peirce's agapism. Yeah.
Yeah, I know we're over time, but just since you're evolutionary biologist, I really want to put this to you. Like, I sort of think of both cybernetics and evolution as kind of Peirce's degenerate. Like, you have teichastic evolution and anachastic evolution, chance and law, and that very brilliantly, both in AI and evolution, all these models are essentially degenerate forms of evolution, and that we need this third in order to move forward. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, there would be a lot of devils in the details to unpack there, but I think broadly speaking, I would agree with that. I mean, when Jack was talking about the necessity of cybernetics, I mean, as a general, thought of organization and how to think rigorously about organization and sort of self-governance and all of that, of course. But the cybernetic literature is littered with issues, and including, I mean, second order cybernetics gets some things really, really wrong for me. But some of the grounding problems are the formalisms. I mean, those are both what gives cybernetics its instrumental power and why it was such an influential lineage on subsequent system science, but also at the same time are what create the inherent limits of a program like that, to the extent that it is too beholden to the formalisms, which are basically, I mean, the variational calculus, probabilistic formalisms that are essentially Laplacian, right, in a very profound way, and they are predicated on the existence of a predetermined state space. So there are, yes, there's a sense of degrees of freedom in that a system can go left or right or whatever, it can move through a space, but everything is predetermined in that space. It's a set of discrete states. So there is a strongly deterministic aspect. There's not a genuinely creative aspect to the formalisms there. And this is a problem that characterizes some of the heavily formal, lineages or models and methods and research programs downstream of cybernetics, like the free energy principle, right? So there's a discrepancy there between some of the flowery language and the saying of things that sound really right, and then the beholden to the formalisms, which actually make some of that stuff, well, just flowery rhetoric, essentially, right? That actually refute some of the interpretive steps that people want to make. And models are super important, right? But we need to be very, very clear about where we're making these distinctions. I mean, the problem with having a model that would actually enable the state space itself to be like dynamically reconfigured based on every step that some system makes within it, is that the equations are going to blow up in your face, right? That's going to be non-computable. And so that's why, in order to pursue things in, like you were saying, AI, computational models, etc., you need to make these fundamental assumptions in order to enable the program to complete running or whatever. And that's totally fine and dandy and all of that. It's just we need to explicitly acknowledge that. And I do think the framework of Peirce and degenerate evolution would be a really nice way of getting at that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
We need to wrap up here, but Spiridon, did you want to chime in or just tell us
Yes,
you have to go to
I
bed?
would like to try, although it's 3 in the morning here and I have an unstable connection, so it could be interrupted. I liked very much what Timothy said, Timothy's response to Joss, because I'm very critical about the models in systems biology, about the models in self-organization. So therefore, I say that biological self-organization is something totally different than the self-organization that we can compute. Because you have this problem, exactly what you said now, that you have varying state spaces. Even the cell cycle needs a varying state space because it creates again and again new variables. And this is exactly what I'm going to say tomorrow, because this is my understanding of entities that determine their own essence. And actually, I mean, we can say that there are entities that determine their own essence, but as soon as you try to formalize that, you get huge problems. We don't have a logic to talk about that in a formal language. In a natural language, you can say everything. But in English, in Greek, in German, but in formalism, it becomes, I mean, I'm talking about formalisms that have not about qualitative formalisms, but about quantitative formalisms that make exact computations.
Yeah, I love the point, Spirit, and unfortunately, I won't be able to see your talk tomorrow. It'll be too, middle of the night for me. But I'll watch it later, and we'll talk. It's 10 in the morning for me now, but most of the talks unfortunately take place, right. I mean, you're up at 3, so maybe I'm just making complaints. I'm going to blame it on my 3-year-old daughter and the fact that I don't get enough sleep as it is. I would be just completely gaga if I tried to all night conferencing. But I really love your point. And so I would say again here, this is this intervention of primary variation in a certain sense, because that's what's not, submittable to this formalization, because the kinds of formalizations that you're talking about are intrinsically, necessarily, slightly preformationist. They're preformationist, right? So they have to have what I would call content-laden postulates. In order to you have to define a space of possibility from the very beginning in order to pursue that kind of approach, and we don't want to do that. I mean, so I make use of those formalisms, and we've been making use of like language models in reconstruct. We have protein language models now. We're using them to reconstruct relationships amongst proteins, which is fascinating. And I'm not sure if I learned anything from that, but it was fascinating anyway. We got some good figures. But yeah, we just want to be clear that there is a whole aspect of life, and in fact, what is characteristic of life, to your point, which cannot be fully described in those terms. And that's again where I think that Stenger's point about the speculative approach to evolutionary biology is really, really a key point.
One more thing, that this way we have to compute things, creating mechanisms, is also a manifestation of something vital.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I mean? That these are mechanisms, formal mechanisms, but we can create those things because we are not machines, not mechanisms, but vital things.
This is
This is Canguilhem. I know.
Yeah. I mean, he just makes the point just so lucidly, and I didn't manage to convey it perfectly in my talk because it's just, you would have to just say read the paper because it's just so beautiful in there. But the model for the living machine is life itself, and of course he'll talk about how early machines, but prior to the advent of automata, all these machines were deriving their power from life anyway, right? So, there's an ox tethered to the thing, or a person is actually, applying some kind of vital impetus or whatever. So it's only with the advent of the automaton that we get this idea that maybe living systems are automatons, but the automaton is already a model based on the living system, right? So it's a very, very circular, is what Canguilhem is saying. You always have life at the origin. And this, I mean, Jack mentioned Raymond Ruyer and cybernetics and the origin of information. This is a key point that Ruyer is making, right? Like there's transmission between, two telephones, but the machines aren't going to start talking to each other, is Ruyer's point at that time. I mean, LLMs, maybe they are, but at the end of each of the receivers, there is an agent. And this is something that just Simondon's whole critique of information theory is predicated on this notion that the schematisms of information theory leave out the agents who already are imprinted with the signal form. It's because they share a sense of meaning, a language or whatever it is, that you can then you can quantify information and transmit it, but only because they both know how to encode and decode already, right?
Okay.
Wonderful. All right. Well, it's a good sign that we can't manage to wrap up on time because the conversation is so good, but we have a somewhat shorter day tomorrow. We begin at 8:30. Hope to see you all there. I know, Tim, you'll be asleep, but
I'll be at the panel. I'll come for the panel.
Great. Perfect. Well, thanks so much, everyone who's still here. This was the after party, I guess. And yeah, lots of wonderful ideas that I will hopefully be digesting and dreaming about tonight, and look forward to another day tomorrow. So,
Okay,
thanks.
thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt.
Bye.